Piaget was very interested in how you produce structures that enable you to regulate yourself, because you're like a kind of a colony of strange sub-animals that have to figure out how to get along so that you can sort of be one thing. You kind of learn that, I would say, between the ages of 2 and 4 as you're being socialized. You know how erratic 2-year-olds are. I mean, they're a blast, and it's part because they're erratic. It's like they're unbelievably happy, and then they're unbelievably hungry, and then they're really hot, and then they're really upset and crying, you know, and then they're really scared. It's like, and all of that's just untrammeled, and so it's really fun to be around them, especially when they're happy, because they're so happy that it's just, you know, you don't ever get to be that happy. And so it's nice to be around a 2-year-old because you can kind of feel that again, you know. And one of the horrible things about being a parent is that you spend a tremendous amount of your time making your child less happy. And the reason for that is that positive emotion is very impulsive. You know, and you know, because everybody says, well, you should be happy. It's like, well, no. When you're happy, you're actually quite stupid. And so, because happiness makes you impulsive, happiness says, hey, things are really good right now, get what you can while the getting's good. And so, like if you're hyper optimistic, manic, we'll say, it's like every stock investment looks like a really good stock investment. It's like you go out and spend all your money because look, there's those wonderful things everywhere and you could do such great things with them, and then, you know, you spend all your money and then you crash and you think, oh God, my life's over, you know, because I just spent all my money on all this useless stuff, and it's all under the grip of impulsive positive emotion, you know. And so when you're telling your kids to be quiet and settle down, it isn't because they're making a lot of noise being in pain. It's because they're running around like wild baboons having a blast and disrupting things like mad, you know. And so you got kids, you got to settle down, you know, like quit having so much fun. And it's kind of awful that you do that, but you do. And that's because the emotions and the motivations have to be brought into like a relationship with one another within the person, so that, you know, one thing I remember with my son, who is he's quite disagreeable by temperament, which is actually a good thing as far as I'm concerned, although it brings its own challenges. And so with my daughter, when she was misbehaving, she was pretty agreeable. And, you know, if she was misbehaving, I could basically just look at her and then she'd quit, you know. But my son, it was like, that was just nothing. You're looking at me, it's like, no, that's just not going to go anywhere, man. And so then I'd like tell him to stop, and that really wasn't having much of an effect either. He'd just sort of maybe laugh or run away or whatever. I mean, he was a tough little rat. And, you know, what I would do with him is he would be doing something and I'd interfere and he'd get upset and, you know, angry. And so then I'd get him to sit on the steps, and I told him, and this is when he was about 2, I said, look, you're going to sit on the steps, that's timeout. You're going to sit on the steps until you've got control of yourself and you can come back and play the family game again. I basically said, be a civilized human being and then you're welcome again. And so he'd sit on the steps. It was so interesting to watch because he was just enraged. He'd sit there. Like, have you ever seen a 2-year-old have a temper tantrum? It's really quite the bloody phenomena. If you ever saw an adult do that, you'd call 911 right away. It's like, oh my God. And I've seen adults do that, you know, because people say with borderline personality disorder will have temper tantrums, and it's like, man, you want to be about 30 feet away from that person, that's for sure. It's really, but in kids, it's like, well, first of all, they're only this long, so how much trouble can they really cause? But it's like, you know, they're just completely gone. They're like on the floor, their face is red, they're just furious, like way more furious than you ever get if you're even vaguely socialized. They're just outraged, and they're kicking and hitting the ground, and like, it's like a little epileptic fit of anger, you know. They're completely controlled by their rage. And we took care of one kid for a while who, he was actually a pushover, that kid. You could get him to behave by, you know, kind of shaking your finger at him, but his mother thought he was really tough because he had her figured out. And one of the things he would do is have a temper tantrum, and during the temper tantrum, he would hold his bloody breath until he turned blue. It's like, try that. Like, you know, that's your homework. Go home and have a temper tantrum, and while you're doing it, hold your breath until you actually turn blue. It's like, you won't be able to do it. You don't have the willpower of a 2-year-old, that's for sure. That little varmint, man, he'd just have a fit. then he'd hold his breath, and then he'd turn blue. It was like, wow, that's amazing. And we would just like let him do it. And, you know, he'd turn blue, and everybody would be gone, and he'd come out of it, you know, and it didn't work. So he just quit doing it. I think he did it like twice, and he figured out, oh, well, that's a lot of work for very little outcome. And, you know, it's not like 2-year-olds are stupid. They're not stupid. They're probably smarter than you, but they're not civilized by any stretch of the imagination. And so anyways, back to my son, I'd put him on the steps, and he'd be like, just like enraged and trying to get himself together, you know. And I'd wait a few, I got a strict rule, which was as soon as you're done, you're welcome again. So it's completely under your control. You get yourself calmed down, you come and talk to me again. If you're calm enough so I like you, then you're welcome back in the family. No grudge, nothing. And so it's harder than you think. Like, people think they like their kids. It's like, don't be thinking that. They're hard to like. They're little monsters, and they're very, very pushy and provocative. And so lots of parents do not like their children, and they do terrible things to them their whole life. So it's no joke, and it's very common. And, you know, that was Freud's observation, fundamental observation, that a lot of psychopathology is rooted in the family, and you can be sure of that. You know, and when you hear about some mother who's done something terrible to her child, which happens reasonably frequently, you know perfectly well that she has a very terrible capacity to discipline. The child's just provoked her and provoked her and provoked her and provoked her and provoked her, and it just happens to be a day where her new boyfriend left, and she's quite hungover, and she got fired, and it's like, that's the wrong day to provoke her. And then she does something that is not good, and you read about it and you think, well, how could that happen? How could anyone do that? Well, that's how they do it. And so, and kids are very provocative, just like little chimps. Chimps will, the adolescents will like throw little pebbles and sticks at the sleeping larger males and bug them. And that teasing, which it is, that teasing turns into full-fledged dominance challenge behavior once the adolescent males get big enough to do it. And so when you're being provoked by a child, which they provoke you all the time, they're trying to figure out, well, just where are you exactly? What happens if I do this? What happens if I do this? You know, and how else are they going to figure it out? Anyways, he'd sit on the steps and he's just enraged and trying to control himself, and I'd watch that, and then, you know, I'd come back after about 2 minutes or whatever, and he'd still be, I'd say, well, you know, have you got yourself under control? Are you ready to get off the steps? And he'd go, no, not yet. And then, you know, he'd get himself under control, and then he'd come back, and, you know, he'd be contrite, and then I would like him right away. You know, you got to watch that, you know, because you don't like being dominated by a 2-year-old. No one does. And so if the child hasn't mastered himself and started to act in accordance with the prevailing social norms, you won't like them. Well, you think, oh yeah, I will, because, you know, I'm a good person. It's like, no, you won't, and no, you're not a good person, so don't be thinking about that at all. It's just not true. So when he was contrite, then he'd come, and then, you know, we just go on like nothing had happened, because that's what you want to do, right? As soon as you get compliance, especially if the compliance is in the best interest of the child, you want to reward it instantly, right? That's the right thing to do, because so then, and you could just see him gaining control over himself. And so really what was happening is, in his mind, in his brain, we'll say, there was a war between the psyche, the ego, that was starting to become integrated, you know, and starting to become a continuous person, an identity. And it's fragile in 2-year-olds. It can be disrupted all the time, and it is. That's why they're so hyper emotional. It's fragile, that little ego, and it doesn't have a lot of power. And so what you want to do is reward it when it wins. You know, it's when he gets control over the underlying motivations. You want to say, hey, good work, man, good work, kid, you did it, you know, you got yourself under control, way to be. And the kid's really happy about that, because it's actually not that much fun to have a temper tantrum. It's exhausting, you know, it takes you over. So Pinocchio goes off to meet the coachman, and the coachman has already said he's collecting bad little boys, and he's got them all in the coach. They're all delinquent types here, and the ticket on the coach was the Ace of Spades, which is what Pinocchio is holding, and he's with this character here called Lampwick. That's an interesting name. So he's the thing that burns in the middle of a light, Lampwick, And that's interesting because it's a play on Lucifer, because Lucifer means bringer of light. And so Lampwick is a play on that. And Lampwick is really a nasty piece of work. He's got this false arrogance about him. He's got this like cynical voice, really deeply cynical voice. And he's only, I don't know how old he's supposed to be in this, maybe 12 or something like that, or 13. And so he's one of those kids who's become prematurely cynical. I'll tell you a story about that. So I used to live in Montreal. I lived in a poor neighborhood. And one day I was out in the back alley building a fence because I was putting a little fence around my little tiny backyard. And there was a house across the alley down the street a ways where there was a lot of like not good partying. A lot of bikers were hanging around there. And I knew there was a little kid that lived there as well. Anyways, I was out there in the back alley pounding away on my fence, and these little kids came up, and they were little. They were like 3 and 4 years old, hey? And they spoke Joual, right, kind of really heavily accented Quebecois French, and so my French isn't good, so I could hardly understand them. But they were watching me hammer, and they got a little closer, and they had one kid who was clearly the leader, had a real scowl on his face, hey? And so they were watching, and I kind of motioned to one of them that they could use the hammer. And that kid said, and I'm going to mangle this, but he said, "Je volais," or something like that. And what it meant is, "I'll steal that." And so I thought, and then he came over and he tugged on it, and he wanted me to take it. And he was quite angry, and, well, I wasn't going to let him take it. And then so I couldn't engage him. I couldn't get him to play, and his buddies were sort of hanging around behind him, and they wouldn't come and play because he wouldn't. And so he was hostile right away to me. And then, so the fence piece was laying out in the alley, and these little monsters started running across it, which I thought was really remarkable, but it was terrible at the same time because they were really little kids. That shouldn't be happening when you're like 3 or 4. If that's happening at that age, things are not good. And so that kid was already like seriously not happy with the world. And, I'd been studying antisocial behavior for a long time by that point, and I knew that the kids who are destined to jail later in their lives are kids who are rough and tough when they're 2 years old, but then don't get socialized, or maybe worse, they get anti-socialized, which is exactly what happened to this kid. He'd obviously been ignored and abused. Certainly no one had ever played with him in any real way because he wouldn't play. And it's not good if a kid is that little and you can't get them to play. Something's gone seriously wrong because they're so playful at that age that it's like 90% of them. Anyway, so they were running back and forth on this fence. I thought, stomping on it, and I was right there. I thought, well, first of all, I thought that was remarkable, but I also thought it was absolutely horrifying because, in some sense I could see where this kid was headed and why at that early stage in his life. It's not a pleasant thing to behold, but there was nothing that could be done about it. And that's kind of what this Lampwick is like. He's prematurely cynical. This kid was already cynical and he was like 4 years old. Most kids don't get cynical till they're teenagers, and then often they don't get completely cynical, and usually they more or less grow out of it. But it had happened to him much earlier. So this Lampwick character, he's already decided that he knows everything, that everyone else's opinion is worth nothing, and that there's nothing in culture or society that holds any utility whatsoever for someone like him. Now, you can imagine developing that way if you were raised in a family where people were generally lying to you, and that they randomly treated you or neglected you, and that you couldn't discern anything about them that was admirable or positive. Of course you'd assume that the whole structure is corrupt and that you had to take care of yourself and no one else. Well, not of course. Not everyone assumes that under those situations. I shouldn't say of course. But it's a logical set of conclusions. So, and of course it's proportionate to some degree to how much abuse you take. Although there are lots of stories of people who've been terribly abused as children who grew up to be, kind, remarkable, responsible, thoughtful people who were absolutely opposed to abuse instead of propagating it. There's no direct causal pathway.